It's time for me to introduce one of my favorite JFK scholars. He is the host, along with our friend Rex Bradford from Mary Farrell Foundation, of JFKFacts.org. He is the author of 2011's Snowstorm in August, which is a fascinating story pertaining to President Andrew Jackson and Francis Scott Key, about whom many bad things could be said. And he's the author of this book, Our Man in Mexico, Winston Scott and the Hidden History of the CIA, one of the essential books published, I think, in the last number of decades. It's my pleasure to introduce Jefferson Morley.
Thank you, Alan. Thanks, everybody, for coming here. It's great to see so many friends in one place. It's a little terrifying to think how long I've known some of you. But I'm very excited about attending the conference. I think it promises, I think we've already seen that it is extraordinary, thanks to the efforts of Jim and Jerry. And I think what's most out of the ordinary for me about this conference is, I think, the coherence of the program. Too often when I go to JFK conferences, the results leave my head spinning. What happened? Who? How do you know that? Too many theories, too many characters. I came away from one JFK conference and the best coverage was really in The Onion. President shot 129 times from 43 angles. So I know that's not what happened, but that was the impression that was left. I don't get that feeling at this conference. I'm getting a feeling of convergence and transition. I actually think we're getting closer to identifying the causes, the causal chain of events that led to the assassination of President Kennedy. And we've already seen in the conference that we're getting a more granular understanding of the role of certain CIA officers in those events. Thanks to the work of Bill Simpich and John Newman, we have a much deeper understanding of the role of the counterintelligence staff in the monitoring of Lee Oswald before the assassination. Thanks to Dan Hardway, Ed Lopez, and Bob Blakey, we have a clearer understanding of how and why the HSCA investigation was thwarted. And thanks to Antonio Veciana coming here to tell his very important story of working with the CIA in Miami in 1963. What's exciting, I think, about these findings is that rather than contradicting each other, they mutually reinforce each other. They all shed light on the key outstanding question that was raised by Dan Hardway. What is the CIA seeking to hide about its secret psychological warfare and counterintelligence operations in 1963? We don't have all the answers to that question, but I think we're getting more and more of them. It is painstaking work. Let me tell you one example that I came across in my own work. In the course of my lawsuit, we obtained documents from the CIA, a big batch of documents from the Joannides administrative file, and there were two documents in there that especially interested me. It was a form that Joannides had filled out and signed twice in the spring of 1964, once in April and once in May. On the form, signed by Joannides, his home residence was identified as New Orleans. And so we brought this into court, and in court, Jim Lassar argued on my behalf that these documents showed that Joannides had traveled to New Orleans as part of his official duties at the very time that the Warren Commission was investigating the DRE in New Orleans. Jim cited these documents as testifying to their significance, and he wanted the court to understand their significance. The government responded very forcefully, and in a sworn affidavit, U.S. Attorney Ron Machen denied that the document was related to Joannides' travel. He didn't explain what the document was, and we still don't know exactly. But he said, and I quote, "New Orleans is clearly listed as Joannides' place of residence when on home leave, and the form does not put him in New Orleans on the dates cited by the plaintiff." What Machen didn't know was this: Joannides' family lived in Miami. He's listed in the Miami phone book in 1963. His children attended school in Miami. So Machen thought that Joannides actually lived in New Orleans, or that's where he went when he wasn't working. He didn't know that that wasn't the case. And so I pointed that out in a legal brief it was filed in response to him later in November, and he responded a week later. with a slightly different story, and this is what he said. Morley's claims of purported new information that Joannides traveled to, and those are in quotes, traveled to or lived in New Orleans during the time that he monitored Oswald are false and inaccurate. So now we have the government story, which is this. We can summarize it this way. Joannides maintained a home residence in New Orleans, but he never traveled there and he never lived there. Clearly, we are in need of more clarity on this question. That's why I think those are the sorts of questions that remain to be answered, but those are the things, the kind of detail that we are now getting at. For me, it's gratifying and exciting to see that Joannides figures in what we are learning. I never thought he was a prime mover or a rogue agent in the events of 1963. Rather, I thought what was most interesting about him was that he was a representative figure doing the bidding of his superiors. What we are now learning at this conference shows the depth of that story and brings us, I think, to the verge of a remarkable development. John Newman's story about Tony Sforza and the handling of Rolando Cubella and the Greek case officer involved in the recruiting of Rolando Cubella. We may be discovering, and I don't want to, since I haven't had time to look at all the documents under these, I don't want to overstate or draw conclusions yet, but we may be discovering that two threads of the JFK story, the emergence of Oswald as a pro-Castro activist in 1963, which is publicized by the DRE in New Orleans, and the recruiting of Rolando Cubella passed through the same office in the Miami station. Tony Sforza worked in the psychological warfare branch of the JM Wave station in 1963 when George Joannides was the chief. And this is something that adds credibility to the notion that, that Joannides was the Greek case officer who took over handling aspects of the Cubella recruitment from Sforza because they worked in the same office. I'm not going to draw conclusions about that, but suffice it to say, for right now, we have a fact pattern about the JFK story. We have a new fact pattern about the JFK story that demands attention. Let me just talk a little bit about that. And that this fact pattern is both growing in scope and detail over time. This is not a dead end. The more we learn, the new things that we learn add to this fact pattern and make its significance greater. So I think what we are doing is we are getting to the point where we can describe a fact pattern rather than argue about theories, and we can transcend the old lone nut conspiracy debate. I think we are getting to what I call JFK 3.0. But my subject today is CIA and the culture of secrecy, and so I want to talk a little bit about that and how that relates to what I've talked to so far. I think, in addition to uncovering the full record of JFK's assassination, we need to understand and explain why the events of 1963 are relevant in 2014. If you look around this room, you can see we clearly need a narrative of the assassination story that is relevant to young people, and we don't have it yet. What is our situation today? We find ourselves living in a warlike state with a powerful national security agencies, often acting beyond the limits of the law, at least as the law is understood in a democracy. How did we get here? How did a massive government surveillance program grow up beyond the view of the people? How did our national security state become so powerful? I think with the benefit of the hindsight, we can see that the publication of the Warren Commission report was a signal moment in the growth and consolidation of this secret national security state. It was the moment, it was not obvious at the time, but it was the moment when the national security agencies demonstrated the ability to spare themselves from accountability for a national catastrophe. I constantly marvel, and I think we don't emphasize the point enough in the JFK community. The President of the United States was shot dead in broad daylight. That's astonishing enough, and no one was brought to justice for the crime. That's astonishing too. But the third thing that I think is most astonishing, we need to talk about more, is nobody lost their job. So think about it. No matter how you measure it, no matter who you think was responsible, the President of the United States getting killed in broad daylight is a failure. Given how much the CIA knew about Oswald, it can plausibly be called a CIA intelligence failure. And yet no one at the CIA lost their job or was even demoted. It's worth noting the one qualification to this is J. Edgar Hoover did discipline a number of agents for their actions on behalf of the FBI before the assassination. And I think Hoover understood where his vulnerabilities were, and I think if we study who those FBI agents were and what they did that Hoover sanctioned them for, I think we get clues to understanding what he was so concerned about and where the CIA's vulnerabilities lie. I'm not going to talk about that now, but again, this is where our research is converging on a small group of officers reporting to Dick Helms and James Angleton exclusively, the people who knew about Oswald before the assassination and who concealed all that they knew from investigators afterwards. The identity of these officers and their roles is important to us and to history, but what matters today, I think, is the power, their power, to defy accountability via secrecy justified on national security grounds. That power is still wielded by the CIA and intelligence agencies to this day. We should take note, I think, that the most effective check on the power of these agencies in recent years has come from two sources, WikiLeaks and Edward Snowden. And what these two sources have in common is, sources of information have in common, is they're both exemplars of online civil society. That is to say, ordinary citizens empowered by the internet. And I think that's a lesson we need to learn. Let's talk about JFK in the language of the digital age. JFK 1.0 dropped 50 years ago this week. In contemporary terms, we might say it was a government-sponsored data dump accompanied by a top-down narrative generated by state agencies, Dallas Police Department, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, Lyndon Johnson's White House, with a little help from the Secret Service and the CIA. The meme of a lone gunman was then blessed by various mainstream media gatekeepers at old media institutions like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and CBS News. JFK 2.0 was dropped in December 1991 by Hollywood director Oliver Stone. His epic movie was a counter-myth of Dallas, depicting JFK as a champion of peace betrayed by a patriotic cabal. And Jim Garrison was portrayed as a crusading truth-teller. The film was a box office and critical smash. In contemporary lingo, we could say that Stone's film got massively downloaded into the American imagination. JFK 1.0 users had lost their monopoly on the story. They were disturbed by the popularity of JFK 2.0 and attacked Stone with unusual ferocity. While JFK 1.0 retained its core audience, the multitudes in the multiplex generally preferred JFK 2.0, and they mocked JFK 1.0 statesmen like Arlen Specter and Gerald Ford with unusual glee. And that's where we were stuck until the internet came along. Or rather, until a programming genius named Rex Bradford set up his website, maryfarrell.com, and started putting the most important 1 million JFK documents online. Note that this the real historical record of JFK's assassination was not made publicly available by the government. The National Archives website has a couple of hundred JFK documents online, less than 0.1% of what Mary Farrell has. The historical record of JFK's assassination was not made universally available by the press. That is to say, major news organizations. The best websites devoted to the JFK assassination are probably the Dallas Morning News and PBS Frontline. They're both organized around narrow interpretations of Kennedy's assassination, and they're almost wholly ignorant of the information that has come into the public record over the last 10 years. So what we have in JFK 3.0, which is where we are now, is an unprecedented development. Now anybody anywhere can get access to the original record of the assassination, or most of it. That has never been true over the past 50 years and has only started to be true since Mary Farrell started recently. And it's only going to become more true as time passes. So, as I said, the gatekeepers have lost their monopoly on the story, and I think this fact is going to shape this understanding of JFK's assassination going forward. This iteration of JFK's assassination will not be told by Washington insiders like it was in the Warren Commission, and it won't be told by Hollywood myth makers as it was in Stone's JFK. This iteration of the JFK story is going to be told by online civil society. Call me a techno-utopian, but I think online civil society is going to do a better job of telling the story than the previous actors. JFK 3.0 is going to be told in a new way, and I think the older generation's got to understand that. It's going to be crowdsourced, it's going to be distributed and curated online, it's going to rely on the wisdom of crowds. The end of the old gatekeeper system is going to introduce us a new way that public knowledge and consciousness is formed, and we have to pay attention to that. Also, if you think of the technological tools that are now available as a result of the digital revolution, I think we're going to have new ways of analyzing the old evidence, and I think we need to think about that in the future. I know some of you are probably getting very skeptical at this point and saying, the internet is going to give us the truth, really? What are you talking about? The internet is full of crap about JFK, from whack jobs in Alex Jones land to the fulminations of Professor McAdams. And I would say it's true that the internet is conventionally divided on the JFK story. If you read the Wikipedia entry on JFK's assassination, for example, you'll find that it's basically a JFK 1.0 narrative. There's a lot of JFK 2.0 people out there, especially on Facebook. You know, that's where you can friend a friendly friend from New Zealand who knows a lot about the CIA, and that's an unprecedented source of information. Twitter thinks JFK is an airport. Nonetheless, I'm confident that the potential of the internet to enhance the collective understanding of this formative event has just begun to be tapped. Let me just cite a couple points there. One, people in the online world have this saying, data wants to be free. And I think if data wants to be free, no data wants to be free like JFK assassination data. Look how much of it we have. People ask, well, you know, why do you think that the CIA is going to disclose something, you know, incriminating in the documents that they have released or are going to release? And I point, when people ask me that, I point out to them and say, you know, they were forced to release this stuff. They did not want to release this stuff precisely because they knew that there might be incriminating material in it, and people might be able to do what they call the mosaic approach, piece things together and understand how CIA operations work. But as we've seen at this conference, that is exactly what has happened. Second, in historical perspective, you know, people say, oh God, you know, we've been talking about this for 50 years, you know, I've been talking about it for about 30, you know, it's pretty discouraging. But in the historical perspective, that's not a long time for a great historical crime to be resolved. It isn't. Consider the scandalous story of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. For 180 years, academic historians and Washington journalists were unanimous, and they scoffed at those pathetic souls who believed the ridiculous story that the founding father had an African-American mistress. These lofty pundits proclaimed the truth and denounced the people in much the same language that we hear Warren Commission critics described to this day. Rumor mongers with an unpatriotic agenda that harms, you know, American civic life. And then in the 1980s, DNA science came along, and the testing of Sally Hemings' descendants showed that Jefferson was almost certainly the father of her children. The official story of 180 years evaporated. It's gone. Nobody believes it anymore. And the truth emerged. Such clarity about the causes of President Kennedy's death are not inevitable. I'm not saying that. But with JFK 3.0 and with internet technology, I think I've got to believe that it's at least possible. So let's recap. JFK 1.0 was a government release. It told us that a crazy man shot the president for no reason, and then another crazy man shot him. The hashtags on this message were tragic story, trust us. JFK 2.0 was a Hollywood release. It told us Oswald was the patsy of Kennedy's right-wing enemies in the CIA and the Pentagon, and the hashtags were conspiracy and up the establishment. JFK 3.0 is the story of online civil society. It tells us Kennedy's death was a massive failure on the part of US institutions that requires explanation to each new generations of Americans. And the hashtags are accountability and full disclosure. Where does this leave the perennial conspiracy discussion? I personally hope that JFK 3.0 will relegate it to history. In my experience, I find this more and more. JFK conspiracy theories are what people talk about when they don't know or don't want to talk about the historical record, and especially the historical records that has emerged in recent years. We don't need to theorize about the new JFK fact pattern. We need to describe it, we need to organize it, and we need to make it accessible online to the next generation. I think we're making an important step in that direction this weekend. In so doing, I also think that JFK 3.0 will shed light on the origins of the secret national security state that is still with us. Thank you.